This is the Husqvarna Norden 901 Expedition, and I've been riding it for the past week or so, and it really is rather good. But how does it compare to one of the absolute benchmarks in the category, the Honda Africa Twin? Well, I'm here at Superbike Factory in Bristol today to ride them back to back to find out. But before we get underway, I just want to say a massive thanks to Superbike Factory for supporting the channel and sponsoring this video. They stock thousands of different bikes, all different genres and different price points. Some of them almost new. This Africa Twin, for example, that I'm riding today is a 22 plate, less than 2,000 miles on the clock, and yet you could save yourself well over £1,000 versus the price new. So do check out their website, which I've linked to down in the description below, to see all of their awesome bikes. And once again, a massive thanks to Superbike Factory for their support. Now, I've got to say, after riding both of these bikes today, they're both absolutely awesome and brilliant in their own regards. And actually, there's quite a lot of similarities between the two. They're pretty much even on price, so the Africa Twin brand new comes in at £13,049, whereas this Expedition version of the Norden 901 is £13,599. As for the engines, you've got a parallel twin in both bikes, and they make very similar power figures. So just over 100 horsepower each and about 100 Newton meters of peak torque. And they both make those peak figures at very similar points in the rev range. And they're also quite similar in their intended usage. So they're both the most off-road biased models in their respective lineups. With the Norden, you've got this Expedition version, which takes the standard Norden 901 and jacks it up and makes it taller and gives it more protection. And then with the Honda, it's a more stripped back and simple version of the Adventure Sports, which sits at the top of the lineup and is a little bit more feature laden and touring focused. So yeah, off-roady, parallel twins, about 13 grand, but there are some key differences that you've got to consider if you're trying to choose between these two bikes. So let's start with the Norden, and the first thing that anyone will notice about this bike is just how good it looks. Now, Husqvarna is actually owned by the same group as KTM, and a lot of their bikes share the same platform, and so this has a lot in common: the engine, the chassis, a lot of the underpinnings with the KTM 890 Adventure. Now, in my book, the 890 Adventure isn't a brilliant looking bike, but they've done an amazing job applying that clean, modern, Scandi Husqvarna design language to this bike, and the result is something that really does look quite striking. Now, that isn't to say that the Africa Twin is a bad looking bike. In fact, I think it's one of the best in the adventure market, especially in the classic sort of white, blue and red paint job. It's a brilliant looking machine, but I think it's fair to say that the Norden just pips it in that regard. I like the overall shape of it. I like some of the semi-retro touches, like the round mirrors and the big round headlight. I like some of the choices of finish as well, like the bare aluminium and the white on the handguards and the side of the seat here. And specifically on this Expedition version, you get this brilliant looking graphic scheme along the side, just elevates it a little bit above the standard bike. Beneath the aesthetics though, another thing that I really love about this bike is the snap you get from this engine. Like I say, the power figures are pretty much the same, so 100 horsepower, 100 Newton meters of peak torque, but this is the one that really does feel like it's got a bit of that hooligan factor, and it's got a real immediacy to the throttle delivery. Naturally, with any modern adventure bike, you've got a whole bunch of different riding modes, but in the street mode or the more aggressive rally mode, you really do get this like kick if you give it a quick turn of the throttle, and it turns this thing into an absolute wheelie monster. It's also got a nice free revving feel as well. It doesn't feel like it's got a great deal of inertia, so it's not like a sluggish, lazy feel. It really does feel quite sprightly, and so it makes it bags of fun to ride on the road. Now, the big advantage of the Expedition version of the Norden 901 is this suspension. So the suspension on the standard bike is absolutely fine. In fact, it's pretty decent. It's WP, which is their in-house brand, and it's from their Apex lineup, and it does a perfectly good job of both on and off-road riding. But with this, you're only paying about 900 quid more than the standard version. Plenty of little extras across the bike, which we'll get onto, but I think you're getting most of the value just from the suspension alone. Now, it's pretty much the same stuff that you'll find on the KTM 890 Adventure R, so a little bit more off-road focused, and so you've got more travel front and rear, which gives you a little bit more ground clearance, and of course you've got full adjustability all round. I will say though, there is a little bit of compromise, certainly on road. I mean, firstly, it is quite tall to get on, even with the seat in the low setting. But also when you're on the move, despite the fact that it's got this super low slung fuel tank, you know, you can feel that the weight is held pretty high and it does pitch quite a lot and it feels quite gangly for road riding. But you know, that said, if you are planning to do some serious off-road riding on one of these bikes, this is a very good reason to consider the Norden. But look, even despite the suspension, I think it's pretty easy to justify this Expedition version over the standard Norden 901, just for all the little bits of spec and accessories that you get as standard. So at the front, we've got the touring windscreen, which sits a little bit taller and also has this vent in the middle to reduce buffeting. And I'd say, even though it looks relatively modest, this windscreen, and it isn't adjustable either, it actually does a very good job when you're cruising at sort of 65 or 70. Now, also playing into the sort of touring image, you've got heated grips and a heated seat for the rider. Massively beneficial if you want to ride it through winter, or if you're doing some touring and you're going to pass through some cooler climates. Plus, you get this soft luggage, so 18 litres either side. I like the fact that it sort of ties in with the rest of the bike in terms of the visuals, and it comes on these rigid frames with a quick release mechanism. I mean, look, they're not a substitute for proper three-piece luggage. If you're doing proper distance work or going two up and you want to take plenty of stuff with you, then these probably aren't going to quite cut it. But as a standard accessory on a bike at this price point, it's a nice little touch. Down low, you've got this extra protection from this big sump guard that wraps around this low fuel tank and keeps it nice and safe. Still probably an asset even if you're not off-roading as well. If you dropped it in a car park or something, you probably want to have this on just to protect the bike. And you also get a quick shifter as standard, so that's quite a lot of little extra things, not just against the standard Norden 901, but also the Africa Twin. No heated bits on that one, no quick shifter, no luggage. It's a low windscreen as well. And so if you did want to spec this bike up for a little bit of light touring, it's going to push the price up quite a bit, and that makes the Norden Expedition look quite tempting. One last little victory here for the Norden would be the ease of use of the menus and the switchgear and the dash. This genuinely feels quite fun to use. They use little graphics and stuff like that, and also that clean, minimal design from the rest of the bike does run through to the dash, whereas the Africa Twin has an absolute array of buttons. There's loads of them, and the dash is just a little bit sterile feeling. It doesn't have the same sense of fun or dynamism. Now, I know I said I love the engine on the Husqvarna for its liveliness and free revingness, and when you want it to be fun to ride and entertaining, then it definitely does the job. But the Honda just feels like it has a little bit more satisfaction to it. It's got a couple of hundred extra cc's of capacity, and so despite the fact that those peak power and peak torque figures are almost identical, actually this is the one that feels like it has a little bit more guts in the mid-range. The other thing as well is the sound that this thing makes is really very, very satisfying when you're on the throttle. It's sort of got like a chug-in, almost like a single cylinder kind of sound, and it just absolutely suits the nature and image of this bike. This engine has a 270 crank, which gives it like the 90-degree interval between the two cylinders, so a little bit like a V-twin. This has a 75-degree interval, I think, to mimic the KTM V-twins. And so while they do both sound pretty good, I think if you listen to this, you'll agree that the Africa Twin does edge it acoustically. Now, like I say, I think suspension-wise, the Norden edges it in terms of like off-roadiness, but I think the Africa Twin has a little bit of a better balance for all-round riding. You see, it's more than capable off-road. I've ridden it for a day at their adventure centre down in Exmoor, and it was absolutely brilliant on the trails. But on the road, it just feels that little bit more composed than the Norden, and it feels a little bit less boingy and wallowy. And I've checked the settings on both bikes, and it seems to be pretty much middled out in terms of the damping adjustment. And still, for me, the Africa Twin just feels a bit more firm and more appropriate for, like I say, a wider spread of riding. Now, another big plus for me on the Honda would be that renowned build quality. And while I've only had the Husky for about a week or so I can't speak too much about the sort of long-term reliability of it, you know, my experience of Hondas over the years has been very, very good, and it also feels just that little bit better put together. Things like the quality of the plastics, and also stuff like the fact that you get a proper metal fuel tank as opposed to plastic covers on a plastic tank, just help to make it feel that little bit more premium to me. I've also got to mention, as with many other Hondas, that little trump card, which is that this engine is available with a DCT gearbox. They're not for everybody. It basically acts like an auto box, so it shifts on your behalf. No clutch to work, no gear shift on the pegs, and I think for some people that does remove a little bit of the satisfaction of riding, but I will say it's an absolutely fantastic system, far better than I ever anticipated it to be, and I would even say the same for riding it off-road. It just seems completely counterintuitive to use DCT off-road, but once you give it a try, as you can do at the Adventure Centre, it really does make sense, and it's a lot easier to get on with than I expected. Plus, you can always knock it into manual and use the triggers on the switchgear to control it, and also there are different modes for it as well, so you can adjust how keen it is to shift. And so if that sounds like your cup of tea, it really does transform the riding experience, and it puts this bike in a field of one. Another big one for some people anyway is going to be the fact that the TFT dash on this bike gets Apple CarPlay, and yes, the dash on the Norden is really nicely designed, but in terms of like interface design and software design, you can't really beat, you know, the same people that designed the iPhone interface. Having all your favorite messaging and music and podcast and navigation apps all on the screen there just makes it so much easier to use and more intuitive. And again, it's something that's only really available on the Africa Twin. There's no other adventure bike on the market, as far as I'm aware anyway, that comes with CarPlay. Honestly, these two bikes are just so good and so enjoyable to ride that it's really difficult for me to pick between the two. Generally, I'd say go for this one if you want the one that looks the best, has the most peppy and lively engine, and the one that sits, you know, pretty tall and has that more extreme off-road bias. The Honda, though, has that satisfaction with the engine. It really is a lovely example of the parallel twin. You've got that renowned Honda build quality and reliability, and then also a couple of little tricks up its sleeve with DCT and CarPlay. As always, I'd love to know which one you'd pick down in the comments below, so do let us know. A massive thanks again to Superbike Factory for their support, and I'll leave you with a selection of our other favourite adventure bikes from the Superbike Factory showroom, which you can click on the screen here and give it a watch now. Many thanks for watching today, and we'll see you in the next one.